Greetings, my friends. This is Celeria Rosencroix once again, and we are now looking at the Dark Souls character creator. I know I did actually create a character already in order to run through the intro sequence, and I shall be playing as that character. However, it is also the case that we can gain lore by looking at this, and we can say that we have the information provided to a new player based on the character creation sequence as such. Let us see what we can piece together about the world based entirely upon these. Sex, male, female, to be expected probably. Class, you start out with a warrior, fearless, weapon expert, high strength and dexterity. By high strength and dexterity, they appear to mean specifically both being at 13. Perhaps that isn't terribly unreasonable. If we look at the knight, however, they do not have these sorts of numbers. So, it's an interesting sort of comparison. The strength and dexterity of the warrior are significantly better than that of the knight. But the knight has a more evenly distributed bent overall and a specialty in vitality, which the warrior is relatively lacking in. It would be specifically a low-ranking knight that we would be choosing to join this world as if we chose this class. High HP, solid armor, not easily toppled. The toppling bit is an interesting one, as it implies there's some sort of mechanic in the game that would allow us to be knocked over. I imagine it has something to do with the level of impact that your character is receiving. Perhaps different builds of armor allow you to have different responses to such a thing. If the solid armor is correlating with not easily toppled, this would be pretty natural. It's also worth noting that this is the same sort of helmet that the knight who came to rescue us at the asylum actually was wearing, but their visor was down rather than up. So we can expect they're probably a low-level knight as well. Wanderer. Aimless wanderer wields a scimitar, high dexterity. Scimitar is an interesting thing insofar as it takes us a little bit out of what would be considered the Western world, so to speak. It comes from the Middle East and then on towards the area of India, though scimitar itself is a sort of British term referring to the general class of Islamic swords, rather than referring to a singular weapon of a sort, which might be easily named. Regardless, since it's talking about people who have these sorts of Eastern weapons, I suppose they might be a wanderer from the East, but to a lesser extent than perhaps the ethnicity that we shall see later. Regardless, high dexterity on this particular build. In fact, it's the same amount of dexterity as the thief -1, which puts it at a rather dramatically high level, all things considered. They have a larger shield than the thief, however, implying they're probably a more significantly skilled warrior. Heavier armor overall, even though it's pretty light. The bandit is the equivalent of the hero class from the Elden Ring video game, which is quite interesting. But in this game, they have slightly more armor, it would seem. Very slightly. Not as much in the way of shoulder protection, which is a little bit awkward. But at the very least, their torso is more protected. This shield is similar to ones which featured in King's Field as well. Regardless, bandits are stereotyped as having high strength in this game. And the battle axe does indeed look rather heavy. Hunter. Bow-wielding as you might expect for one, but also armed with what appears to be a longsword. Okay at close range, but weak with magic. that it has any magic at all is actually pretty interesting. It has a slightly larger shield than that of the Wanderer, but the Bandit has almost exactly the same size of shield. Sorcerer suggests that there is a class of individual who is capable of casting what it calls soul sorceries. They specifically come from the Vinheim Dragon School. That is something we should probably take note of, as the dragons were enemies of the gods, and there is only a singular dragon that is left, rather than none, I suppose. I wonder if it's the case that that dragon happens to have begun a school of sorcery. This wouldn't be entirely out of the realm of possibility. Regardless, we shall keep in mind soul sorceries and note that it is a little bit odd to hear that compared to the swamp pyromancer here. Casts fire spells and wields a hand axe. It's worth noting that the pyromancer actually has more strength than the knight, which is almost shocking, but beyond that particular issue. That they are called a pyromancer is a most intriguing thing, because the flame is associated with the soul in this particular game, which would lead one to believe that not only might it be a type of sorcery that you would expect a cleric to actually have. God of Sunlight is also the man with the biggest fire, after all. But Pyromancer, well, it sounds like it should be someone who is manipulating souls in general, like the soul sorceries that this sorcerer actually happens to wield. Now, this might seem to be a very confusing sort of situation, but if you play Demon Souls, then you will know that it's actually the case that faith and intelligence-based magic are actually from the same source. So I imagine it's the case that the pyromancers, the sorcerers, and the cleric are all actually wielding the same relative sort of magic. It's all drawing from the power of their souls, the ability to manipulate them. But it's the case that the sorcerer, since they come from a dragon school, must be learning magics that are sourced from Seath. The pyromancer, wielding flame sorceries, or whatever they're called, pyromancies perhaps, those must be sourced from the Witch of Izalith and her daughters, since they created great firestorms, as shown in the intro sequence, and the clerics probably are followers of Gwyn. That would make some degree of sense, since we have this sort of strong division of the gods that we have learned about so far, and I imagine they have quite a few followers who are being taught magical powers by these entities. At the very least, that seems like a straightforward interpretation of what the game is providing you right now. Clerics also have slightly more power than the knight. Very interesting insofar as this puts them on equal footing with the pyromancer. But the pyromancer doesn't have as much in the way of intelligence as the faith of the cleric. The intelligence is slightly more on the sorcerer than the cleric's faith, which is a curiosity. And attunement is 15 on the sorcerer, 12 on the pyromancer, and 11 on the cleric. We don't exactly know what attunement is at first blush, but we might be able to find these things out later on. So, there is this final class, the Deprived, an unclothed enigma, armed only with a club and an old plank shield. Strikes me that this is essentially hard mode. You can tell that it has all of its stats evenly distributed, so the advanced players will be able to actually go in, take this weak class, relatively speaking, with very minimal equipment, and because of their more advanced nature, will be able to handle that sort of relative lack of equipment load anyway, and will have the advantage of having even stat distribution and being able to go into whatever sort of specialization they desire. Assuming, of course, that the starting classes don't actually end up with unique items that each of them have that are not acquirable in the game. I doubt that's the case, but we shall find out. Gifts are a very interesting sort of option here. You could choose to go with none, but there is not really much of a reason to other than increasing your own difficulty. First we come to Goddess's Blessing, divine holy water which fully restores HP and status. This is worth noting because a divine blessing by a goddess is something you wouldn't expect based on the intro sequence. The only real goddess that we are aware of is the one who is called the Witch of Izalith, and she should theoretically be someone who is not held in high regard by the world at large. It's also the case that the cleric had healing magic, which means that the Witch of Izalith is probably not going to be producing very good healing items, all things considered. So what I imagine is actually the case is that the four gods in Seath came out on top in the war against the dragons. They went on to sculpt the world in their own image, but because of the fact that there are so many of those huge trees out there, there were probably quite a few fires that were available for other people to grasp Lord's souls from. I imagine it's the case that other deities therefore could actually arise and simply chose not to challenge the status quo, but rather to slot themselves into the position of serving the gods who already had started up a new age. The alternative is that these other gods are the children of the current gods, in which case you'd think they would be called demigods, but if the Witch of Izalith and Gwen actually ended up having children, I suppose it would be the case that they would be full gods themselves, and therefore one of the gods that came afterwards, say the one that creates this blessing, could have taken after her father and started up healing magic specialization. That would be an option that at least presents itself as possible, especially given the fact that there presumably was some time that their alliance lasted before it broke up, before and after the war. And perhaps it would be specifically afterwards, since the Daughters of Chaos seem to have been there at the war, and at the very least, they seem to have all taken after their mother. Regardless, we move on. Black Firebomb explodes upon impact when thrown, more deadly than a standard bomb. So they have explosives in this setting. It suggests that indeed, at the end of this age, there must be some degree of technological development beyond just the standard sword and shield knight stuff that you would expect, since that already existed at the beginning of the Age of Fire. We move on and see twin humanities. Tiny sprites called humanities, sometimes found on carcasses. A little bit strange. What is this humanity that we have come across? How would it differentiate itself from the soul, for instance? We don't get to see an icon for it here. We don't get to actually know what it does, but it is interesting that it is a tiny sprite. That vaguely reminds of the fact that the Witch of Izalith, the furtive pygmy especially, and Nito had relatively small flames that they gripped in their hands. If, for example, the furtive pygmy gave flame to all of humanity to produce souls for them, you could speculate that the souls within humanity then became called humanities. If that's the case, then twin humanities would naturally probably be found on the corpse of, say, a pregnant woman who died, whose child inside of her already had a soul, but was not able to be born at that point. Or conjoined twins or something along those lines. Maybe their souls intermingle in that sort of case. Regardless, we move on to binoculars. Used to peer at faraway sights. Binoculars are very advanced technology indeed, all things considered. So yes, these along with the Black Firebomb suggest that we should be relatively far into a developed world. I don't know that it will be necessarily the case that guns will appear, but with black firebombs, it seems like it at the very least could be possible. But none of the starting classes end up with guns, as far as we can tell, so that is worth noting. Pendant. Trinket. No effect. But fond memories comfort travelers. So this is speaking to the fact that psychology is very important for survival. Having something that shows, say, the face of your wife that you have been forced to leave in your travels, but you kept it with you when you went on to become trapped in the asylum. That is an interesting option. Having something to link you to your past is actually pretty important, but unfortunately it has no effect. So only a sentimental person will choose this sort of option. Unless, of course, they think there's some sort of hidden meaning to it, and that the game is lying to you. Which could be possible. At the very least, it's the case that the narration seems to be deceptive in some ways. So I can understand people trying to figure this out and beating themselves into a wall in order to search the entire game to, say, find a hidden meaning or hidden unlock condition that will activate with a pendant. Master Key opens any basic lock. Initial equipment for thieves. Very curious that there's some standardization in what locks will be unlocked with what sort of keys. It's a little bit strange. I imagine it's actually the case that this is supposed to represent a lock-picking kit. But regardless, I guess it's sort of video game tropey, but is a thing. Other video games have some skeleton key or something that can unlock anything, but this game, fortunately, limits it to only certain locks, which makes it useful, but not something that would break the game. At least one would hope. Anyway, Tiny Beings Ring. This reminds me very much of the Furtive Pygmy. Special Tribal Ring grants small increase to HP. I don't know what the tribe might be necessarily, but given the name, it might simply be the case that the Furtive Pygmy went on to have family, and they created some sort of tribal culture that it was specific to them, the people who would remain with the pygmy and perhaps join it in its travels as it went around the world giving soul to humanity. And then finally, Old Witch's Ring. A gift from an old witch. Ancient ring with no obvious effect. This, it strongly implies, actually should have some way to be used in the game, unlike the pendant. We won't know what it is for some time, and it theoretically could be as much as a curse. It could be the case that it lowers your HP because of the fact that the witch put a curse on the ring and didn't like you, so they gave it to you as a slight. But who knows? It could be something from the Witch of Izalith herself, who, as I said previously, might have been unfairly stigmatized with that name. That sums it up for gifts. We will move on from physique. There's not really very much need to go through here. It's just choosing body type. Face, however, is something interesting. It's essentially the ethnicity for a character in Dark Souls. Commoner is hard to pin down. It's a sort of generic Western European identity. Not much to speak of here. Delta Farmer, however, is something interesting. Commonly seen face in the five-fingered delta. First of all, this calls to mind Egypt. Egypt, of course, is a wide delta, or I should say, has a lot of its population and its culture centered around the river and the delta of the Nile. It was a cradle of civilization, and this is something which is important if one remembers that in Elden Ring, 5 fingers are symbols of intelligence. So, if that idea was already in place all the way back here, it could be the case that the 5-finger delta is actually where humanity first emerged in Dark Souls. Or if we're being a little bit more careful with our wording, where the Furtive Pygmy first appeared and then began spreading souls to humanity. It might have been in this world's equivalent of Egypt. We move on to Astora royalty. Beautiful face of the refined, common in Astora. Unfortunately, there is not enough info to say much more than that Astora nobles have probably sired many bastards, given the genes of the nobility are common in the land's populace broadly. We shall keep an eye on the name Astora, however, because just like the Five-Fingered Delta, it seems to be a location in the world, and that might be something important to understand what exactly is going on here. We move on to Dragon Scholar. Intelligent, sharp lines, but scholarly looks invite insult. Either this field is highly gate-kept by a group with a small gene pool, or some sort of genetic manipulation is happening. Or mutation, perhaps. Given the fact that we find it's the case that a dragon is probably responsible for the birth of what is called sorcery in this world, it seems that the dragon scholars would be those who followed Seath the Scaleless in particular to learn his ways. Given that, it might be the case that he has curried the favor of a particular small group of people who he taught all of his wisdom to, and who he is selective about including others in, which would mean that you have a small genetic pool that hardly ever increases. This would mean that you have specific features being featured on the faces of that group of people. This is a bit speculative, but at the very least it would confirm why they seem to be an ethnicity in this world, despite the fact that it's just a field of scholars. We move on to Thurland Cleric. Looks commonly known in Thurland, known for stalwart clerics. This country must be a religious hub like the Vatican to have a reputation for having lots of clerics like that. It might be an area where, I don't know, it might be where Gwyn initially set up shop or something along those lines. Or at the very least, a place important to the followers of Gwyn. If you keep in mind that, say, Christianity was first emerging in Jerusalem, or that the Greek myths first emerged in Greece, but then both of these religions actually ended up having their centers in Rome, with the Roman Empire first having the Roman gods, which essentially were based on Greek myths, and then switching over to Christianity. It might very well be the case that Thurland is not the original location that Gwyn set up shop, which might be the equivalent to Jerusalem, a sort of holy land. But at the very least, it would have a high number of the clerics who serve him living there. Again, very speculative. We don't really know very much about it, but to have a population that's known for being clerics means there must be some sort of cultural reason that lies at the foundation of the land to build up this sort of identity. They seem to have quite strong jaw lines and maybe a little bit of more pudginess on the cheek and neck compared to everyone else. Moving on, we have Jubilant Katarina. Jovial features of Katarina known for festivity and drinking. Well, it's good that they have an African-inspired option here. Interesting cultural characterization. It vaguely reminds me of the culture of Jamaica, which means they could be sort of inspired by the Caribbean as well. But we don't know enough to judge more about them. We'll find out more as we play the game. Dubious Kareem. Ominous features associated with the Earl of Kareem. This face very much reminds me of the royal members of the House Habsburg, which ended up having very sort of weird-looking and twisted features as a result of the inbreeding that occurred during their reign, their refusal to marry anyone who wasn't royalty. I could see this potentially happening with the family of a particular noble household in the world, and I suppose it could be the case that they then became very successful and spread across various lands, maybe creating an empire after the initial Earl who named the dynasty was significantly in the past. We move on to classic Xena here. Thoughtful, mature face found in historical Xena. For some reason, this option reminds me of Greece. Perhaps my mind just jumps to Xenophon, or I'm thinking of the fact that we have Xena Warrior Princess to remember, but it seems like it would be reasonable to have that sort of option as one of the ethnicities within this world. You have an Egyptian option, you have Western European ones, you have one that might be based on Italy. It just adds a sort of extra layer of diversity to the world, and all of these areas are sort of culturally important to our own history as well. So, with that said, moving on. Eerie Great Swamp. Great Swamp heretics face prejudice for their atypical looks. Curious that they don't face prejudice more for their beliefs, all things considered. But, if we look at this person, the Great Swamp person's complexion and face in general sort of remind me of that of the Witch of Izalith. Given that is the case, and I think it might be the case also on the... Yes. I think it might be the case especially on the male version. Yeah, you can see this more clearly. This skin tone matches more directly, I think, with the Witch of Izalith. But, given that fact, we can think it might be the case that their heretical nature actually reflects them being followers of the Witch of Izalith, perhaps growing out of her initial area of influence. It could be that she settled in a great swamp, for example. And then the population happens to bear the genetics from her and her daughters as a result. It is, again, pretty strange that these would be especially focused on for their looks, but at the very least, if it's the case that they are descendants of the Witch of Izalith, the looks being different from the rest of the world because they come from a different god. If Gwyn was actually the most successful in spreading his genes, for example, that might be why you have the majority of these ethnos ending up looking like they're Europeans. Then it would be the case that you could actually end up with prejudice towards those who look different like this. But it could also just be linked to the fact that the Witch of Izalith is their ancestor, in which case they're associating her with the looks, and the heretic aspect of it is simply a byproduct that they would assume would be in play based on the ethnicity. After all, you have certain ethnicities that are highly linked with a religion in our real life as well. So, we then move on to the final face, which is the Far Eastern Traveler. This archetype is obviously based on East Asians in our real life. They have the sort of almond-shaped eyes going on and a complexion that is closer to an Asian person, relatively speaking. And this is especially seen in the female option. So it's just essentially an Asian stand-in in the setting. It is interesting that that's actually possible, and I suppose it would indicate there might be some sort of genetic diversity underlying in the undead that initially rose up within the roots of the ash trees, or rather, arch trees, to begin with. But regardless, it makes a lot of sense that FromSoft, being a Japanese country, would include at least one option with more Asian-style features. And obviously that's a good thing. That should be about all. Next time we will continue and actually play Dark Souls properly. Until then, this has been Celeria Rosenkreutz, and I say farewell.